Hello, everyone. This is Stephen with Democracy Demythologized, and today we're going to be talking about the Tharu people in Nepal. I'm talking with a Tharu Indigenous activist, and he's going to talk about another way to do democracy, a way that better incorporates the diversity of people around the world and incorporates nature. So, without further ado, let's just get started. We're going to have some technical issues in this conversation, so parts of it are going to have video and parts of it are going to be audio only. So thanks for your patience with that. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Brijlal Chaudhari. How are you doing today?
Hi, Stephen. I'm doing well. Thank you so much for inviting me to have a little discussion around Indigenous people, Tharu people. I'm very happy, glad to be here with you.
Yeah, I am too. And you as both a person, as a Tharu person, one of the indigenous groups in Nepal, have done a lot of activism around that. It seems like you've done that both in Nepal. You're currently in France, doing that work as well. Maybe would you like to give a bit of a kind of a high level overview as a activist? What would you say are some of the kind of the biggest issues facing the Tharu people in Nepal and maybe other indigenous groups too? And what's been happening lately?
Thank you, Stephen, for that question. First of all, I would just give a brief introduction about myself. So I'm Brijlal Chaudhari, a Tharu nation from the foothills of the Himalayas in Nepal. And I was raised in a multi-generational Tharu family. And today I live in France. I studied in United States, went back home, and then came here in France. And I'm a president of Global Home for Indigenous Peoples. That's an association that I started in France. And that association is all about advocacy, based on United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So that declaration was adopted by majority of countries, around the world. And that gives a guideline for countries to work with indigenous people and with respect, with dignity, and they're also part of this world. So my advocacy work is about change, political change, and ensuring that indigenous worldviews, knowledge system, their way of life have a choice, They're not erased systematically by the states and international mechanisms. So indigenous people, they are 6% of the world population, but they protect majority, 80% of the world's biodiversity, So without AI, without, federal funding, but with their knowledge system and their way of life. So imagine this population starts to move away from their territories, there will be a big collapse in the ecosystem of our environment. So my advocacy is all about making sure that indigenous worldviews continue to live. They are as equal as scientific research. It's a living education system. It's a living culture. We're not museums. We're not objects in the museum. It's a living and thriving culture all around the world. So with regards to indigenous peoples, the state is a big barrier. Right now, states have been recognizing the value of indigenous people, their knowledge system, their governance system, yet there is so much criminalization when it comes to indigenous people's right and claiming their knowledge system, their territories, their way of life in the name of development, in the name of infrastructure, in the name of logging, agro-industry, mining, transitional justice. So there is this clause in United Nations Declaration on Right of Indigenous People. It's called free, prior, informed consent, which means when you design something on the territory of indigenous people, they must be consulted. respectfully. And when you consult, that doesn't mean that it's a consent. We have to work together in that project or anything that is related to the future of indigenous people. So that's a big challenge around the world. And in terms of Tharu people, Tharu people live in the southern border of Nepal, and Tharu people also live in India as well, in the northern Uttar Pradesh, as well. But and the challenge is Tharu people, they have their own, still have their own governance system, food system, all the systems, that they did govern themselves. They still have their social and economic and political institutions that has been, the state is trying to replace it with court, judiciary, you know, political parties, but that still exists. And that is very difficult to integrate into the Nepali system that we have, which is still foreign to Thai people, and it's the same happening elsewhere around the world as well. And the challenge is so the government that we have in the southern Nepal, it doesn't fully represent Thai people. So all the administrative offices in the southern Nepal, where the Thai people, majority of Thai people live, you'll hardly see a district chief, who is a Thai person. It's Brahminic, order, dominated by Nepali-speaking, mainstream community. So I'm not generalizing that all higher caste people are bad, but the system prefers that. So there is a very few integration when it comes to job, bureaucracy, army, all these legal institutions that we have. How people have very little representation. So imagine I'm living in my own territory, own village, and the person representing me doesn't come from my community. So is that a democracy? So there is something wrong, in that case. And when Thai people are represented, they are not representing Thai people. They're representing a political party, which has very different meaning when it comes to what it is to be Tharu. So that's the challenge when it comes to Thai. And inequality, of course, is huge. Land grab. The government of Nepal, the king before the revolution, they systematically settled, people from the hills to the region where Thai people were majority. So even from India, the king brought people from India and north to settle in the regions where Thai people live. So you can see like it was systematic land grabbings, territories being taken away, that were originally inhabited and used by Thai people. So right now, like if you look at conservations too, so there are many national parks within our territory, starting from Bardia National Park, Parsa Wildlife Reserve, Chitwan National Park, Kosi Tapu, all these national reserves, they have been there before, as long as Thai people were there. But now they are gazetted, which means like the army has full control. There's a Ministry of Environment who has full control of these things. And there is community forest that evolved, but there is very little representation of Thai people. So it's closed. So resource management, there is very little say when it comes to Thai people. And the Tarai is like the plain land of Nepal. There is so much mix now. So there are people from all ethnicities now living in Nepal, and they have migrated in Nepal, in the southern regions of Nepal. But when it comes to representing issues in that region, you have to be able to speak really well English. Not English, I mean Nepali. So, and Nepali, when it comes to Nepali, the person whose mother tongue is Nepali will definitely be chosen to be leading that process. So that creates a even huge barrier for Tharu leadership to navigate those decision-making spaces. And this is another challenge for majority of indigenous people. Somebody makes a decision for you. claiming that you are a subject. But indigenous people in many countries are sovereign nations. They have their own government system, they have their own education system, social cultural institutions that are not taken into consideration when they make a decision. However, there's a lot of resurgence happening in Indonesia, Peru, Colombia, Latin America is really huge. There are territorial governments that are emerging. They are reimagining their governance system after 100, many years of colonialism, internal, external. So, on one side, it's very encouraging how things are evolving in many parts of the world. The territories are being granted, given legal legal rights, collective rights, not individual rights. So the way we see property, it's mine. Indigenous people don't say that. It's ours. That's how in many parts of the world resources are governed. So when you say, you can do anything with it. And the way we see resources, it's you think about many generations to come. So that's why indigenous people protect their land, their territory, so that it can live. And it's just not humans, it's about the living and non-living relatives that we have as well. So living, the river is also living, the forest is also living, and anything that lives within that territory is living. Even the mountains have spirits, So things like that. So these are the things that are missed, and the worldview that indigenous people hold is often ignored. How do you see wealth? What is wealth? Either you're rich or poor. There's a duality, right? In Western sense, but indigenous people we don't see that way. So there is so many differences, and whose idea gets into a policy is a big challenge. And indigenous people have these ideas of non-duality, when it comes to how we see wealth, it might be a game changer when people are thinking about circular economy. It's not a new thing for indigenous people what circular economy is, sustainability, all these things that we learn in university, you know. Indigenous people have already did a lot of trials and error, that in scientific terms that we use, and the way we manage our resources, the way we manage our territory is a proven fact, So that's a big challenge. And the other one is like knowledge. What is knowledge? So when people write papers, they quote, "This is my knowledge." But for indigenous people, knowledge is has been passed down for generations. And it's a collective knowledge, collective memory. So we cannot, I would say, own knowledge. Like ownership, my ownership. So when I say things about Tharu people, it's a knowledge that have been passed down from generations, my ancestors, So it's a collective knowledge. I cannot own that knowledge, and I cannot privatize the knowledge of Tharu people. So things like that, and intellectual property as well. There are so many innovations that indigenous people have had, like knowledge about medicine, and Western companies comes in, takes that knowledge, does a copyright patent, makes millions of dollars, So these are huge problems, And mining, it's going you're very close. You must have seen how much deforestation is affecting Borneo, Indonesia as well, Philippines. It's a hotbed for criminalizing indigenous people because they are asking for safe, protected indigenous territory. So you see the differences. We want in the race like just know,
Hello?
these are
All right, there we go. That one seemed to be on my
Yeah.
end because it was saying that my connection was unstable. You were talking about Borneo
Mm,
deforestation, and then you were about to
mm,
connect it back to Nepal, and then it cut back out.
mm, mm. So the way our economic system is designed, so let's say France, United States, in the resources that they have is not enough to lead that economy that they are enjoying. The resources come from, yeah, like the economic system that we have, it's very extractive. To benefit some people, get so much from somewhere else. And when we do that, there's a lot of harm that the consumers of that product have very little knowledge about. For instance, oil in Amazon, for instance, that's happening in West Papua, for instance, Philippines, Indonesia, um, Papua New Guinea as well, many countries, and Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, all these territories where there's a huge source of critical minerals, they are indigenous people living around or within that territory. So imagine, you know, what harm it might do. So we're taking something else, but not leaving anything behind. You're just extracting. And there is hardly any reciprocity in that process. It's so much greed. Profit, profit, profit is something that is driving our world and the economy, and that's harmful. But indigenous people don't see it that way. So that's why they are very driven to protect their own territory. And in that process of extraction, very little consultation is done with indigenous people. So that creates a huge challenge. So your future is designed, what do you call, already determined by somebody, and indigenous people don't want that. They want to be part of the future that their children will inherit. So that's the advocacy that I do. you know, and I talk about that in spaces that, yeah, like you are doing. Sharing information, educate, advocate, so that things might change. That's the hope, Stephen.
Yeah, this makes sense. I think you did a very good job outlining a lot of the different issues that Indigenous communities experience and what it looks like. And like you said, a lot of what's going on. It seems like a lot of what's going on in Indigenous communities in Nepal connects with many other the types of things that many other Indigenous peoples are encountering in different parts of the world, like from South America to Southeast Asia. I guess we'll zoom into Nepal and the Tharu people in a second, but I wanted to ask a little bit of a abstract question um, based off of what you were saying. A common narrative that I'll at least see in how people depict Indigenous people is that they are, you know, against modernity, or they're against the times, they're against modernism, they're against, we need these, they just want to shut down development. They don't want the oil pipeline. They don't want the whatever it is, and that's one narrative I will see on the one hand, and then often in my experience, it's often more of a question of, you know the indigenous communities are being siphoned. They're basically, their lands are being like their places are being harvested against their consent, where the resources in where they in their homelands are being basically taken from them for the benefit of others, whether that's different businesses or governments or whoever that might be. Um, how? how do you think about that? Maybe both narratives are wrong in various ways, or how do you conceptualize what's happening, and how the indigenous communities fit within that? Did I lose you? Oh no. Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you. You muted somehow.
Mm.
Ignore that.
Yeah. So when we think about indigenous people in a global perspective, it's not one kind of people.
Mm-hmm.
Within Canada, within the United States, there are so many different tribes. So many different nations. The worldviews, place-based knowledge system. So it's not a homogeneous word when we talk about indigenous people. So there are a lot of differences as well, and we shouldn't put everybody in the same basket. However, when we talk about that indigenous people are not development friendly, progress, all these things, when we have that question or assumption in mind, we need to think about what progress is, and where is that progress will take us, and who is that progress for? These are the questions that we need to think about when we ask that question or assume that indigenous people are not pro-development or progress, all these things. So development, what does development mean in the university sense? um, Government, World Bank, IMF, all these institutions are talking about. But what development means to indigenous people might be very different than what the discussions are led by experts, so-called experts, leading financial institutions around the world, governments, all these things. So that kind of development that these experts are talking about, who is that for? Something that we need to think about. So if we look at Canada, there are a lot of First Nations. They have starting to um, evolve as enterprises as well. They're also doing business, but they are setting the priorities. They are setting the rules and norms and how they do business. So it's not some businesses trying to take away what is theirs. So it depends where you are when it comes to that question. And let's imagine the indigenous people in Brazil, in India, in Indonesia, in many countries in Latin America, that they want to be in isolation, voluntary isolation. Imagine you build a road, So as per United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, they have the right to choose how they want to live. They have the right to um, have to continue their worldview, their way of life. So imagine you built a highway in their territory. Their aspirations of the future is gone. So we have to think where we are when it comes to, and it's not a bad thing. That people want to live in voluntary isolation. So this is another example. And when we talk about not being consulted, that's another issue as well. Often that doesn't happen. Very little consultation is done. And when we do consultation, it has to be in their language. You cannot go with a laptop, speak English, have translator. It doesn't fully translates what the meaning of that discussion is all about. So there is a lot of challenges in that aspect as well. We call it FPIC, and it's a long process. And the companies are in deadline. The project manager is in deadline. But indigenous people's decision-making process is longer. So you cannot pay them off, if you want a real solution. So I wouldn't say that both of them are right. Something that we need to think about. So development means education, literacy, healthcare, um, income, um, how old you live, how long you live. But for indigenous people, that might be very different. Education shouldn't take your children away. you know. Health, it's just not medicine. There is spiritual health, there is health of our territory, there is health of our rivers. All these things need to be considered. And economy, it shouldn't it shouldn't divide people. Economy. And there has to be yeah, equality when we talk about progress. So the progress that we're talking about, look at where we are today with all these innovations. There's so much inequality, injustice around the world. So all this development, where is this leading us? Has to be questioned. And same thing with our economic system as well.
Yeah, I mean, this
Mhm.
may. Oh, I'm sorry. Keep going.
Mhm. And this economic system that we have is very extractive. It so so we outsource everything to somewhere cheap, where we can extract just not the resources but also the labor. So many things, human rights violations, all these things, just to make sure that somebody enjoys that product somewhere, pays for that, and the company makes a huge amount of money at the expenses of you know um, people who do not have jobs. So what is dignity? What is human dignity in all of this? And for a really long time, indigenous people have subsidized this rich nation's growth, progress. And should we continue doing that? So there will be nothing left, Stephen. Amazon is gone, Borneo is gone, the the beauty, the biodiversity that this world needs will be gone if we think, if we look at that development that we have been carrying on for a really long time. So, should indigenous people subsidize this kind of development? Something that the world needs to ask. And development should be self-determined by indigenous people. So, what is self-determination? Is something. There's a lot of resources around. People can look at it. And the idea of democracy, you look around the world, it's not working. So this place-based governance system that we have for indigenous people, we must support as much as possible because they are the owner of the resources. They are the ones who should make the decision where they want to go. So there is like much more diversity in terms of decision making, much more peace. So in Nepal, I'm coming back to Nepal again, we have had so many revolutions. You know, we had like democracy revolution and then we became constitutional monarchy. Again, another revolution. The Maoist revolution for 10 years. There was a lot of violence. Many people get killed. 17,000 they claim it. A lot of displacements, and nothing changed. And now the Gen Z as well came in, and let's see what's happening. But the idea of democracy, this justice, everything, we fail to address the diversity of knowledge, the diversity of what do you call people that live in Nepal, and same thing around the world. We need to respect and integrate each one's worldviews and each other's self-determined development. So Tharu people also did a lot of revolution for their own governance system or demarcation of Tharu Tharu state, but did not happen after the constitution came in 2015. So the movement hasn't stopped, you see. So when will people rest? When will think about progress? All these things. So it fails over and over. And it's the same thing around the world. You looked at Sri Lanka, you looked at Bangladesh, Indonesia. Young people are doing a lot of revolution because their reality doesn't match what the government is trying to do. And these governments are not fully independent. They are driven by uh, this idea of chronic capitalism. So they are just there to benefit this small circle of elite, and it's everywhere, just not in Nepal, but everywhere. So there's a huge government has mechanisms to solve things, but they're becoming distant with their own people and forget about indigenous people. Hmm. Yeah, they're not even in the main agenda. So we have every year we meet for UNFCCC, like COP6, COP30, that was in Brazil. We'll meet next year in Armenia, CBD. There are many things, but decision making for things in indigenous people's territory must go to indigenous people. So climate change, biodiversity, even development, health, all these UN systems and indigenous decision making. So it's happening slowly, but there is still a lot of ways to further to go. Because UN system is made of state and they vote, but indigenous people cannot vote on decisions. That's about their future. So they can only participate and listen to start saying. Ultimately, it's the state that decides, on proposals on world policy development, and it's become challenging. But slowly there is opening, rupture, but again, it's a long road to, you know. So decision making is very important in a global stage, that indigenous people are consulted, are there on the table when we're talking about world biodiversity, when we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about climate finance, when we're talking about economy. It's important so that there is a balance, on everything that we do as a world. So what our leaders are, how to say, need to understand, we're not, everybody's not the same. There is so much differences, and we need to live in harmony, respecting each other and valuing each other and seeing the benefit of having that person next to you. So my grandfather used to tell me, I used to live, my home is very close to Parsa Wildlife Reserve. Before we had open access, now there's army, you have to take permission to go in there. But that forest is very diverse, Stephen. It's subtropical forest. And he used to tell me that this forest is alive and healthy. You don't have to water them, they manage themselves because it's very diverse. Everybody is collaborating, supporting each other, and diversity thrives. And that's what our world leaders are against, diversity. We have to control every single thing. That's a problem that I see. Land management, resource management. But there are experts within that space that we can consult, bring them in. And indigenous people are there as well. So it's something that we need to rethink, and rethink our economy. I think economy is a big problem. So right now, Iran, they blocked the Strait of Hormuz. Imagine all these dependencies that we, So it's gonna, and this will also speed up the mining industry. you know, we need to find alternative. Alternative. Mhm. I would say like alternative economy doesn't do so much harm. Place-based economy as well. Um, yeah, I'll leave it there. Maybe you can ask a question or something.
Yeah, I think you've touched on a lot. I think it's kind of helpful to get this kind of big picture vision. And I agree with you that all these different systems are interrelated between the politics and economics, but also that um, like things like forests are they're often self-sustaining systems, especially things like rainforests. They like literally keep the clouds in, they keep themselves in existence. My question for you is, I want to go a little bit tangible for a second. What's been going on with the national parks and with the military? So, yeah, you hinted at this, but there's been a ton of national parks built in the part of Nepal where the Tharu people are, and it seems like from what you said that when you were younger, they were national parks, but the Tharu people could still kind of go in and out, but now it's been kind of barred by military. What's been going on there? Why is that changed? Why is the military now blocked it? And what's the history behind that?
So the idea of conservation is very Western centric, and it's designed by like university professors in the United States, Europe. That it's a two different system. Human and nature should be separate. That's the idea. This conservation were designed, studied in US. And it moved all over the world, in Kenya, in India, in many parts of the world. So conservation is all about species action, like you forest, you rid of nature and you don't allow it to go in. But indigenous people have a very different relationship with nature or the territory that they live in. There's very little harm that you see when indigenous people are interacting with nature. So if you look at it, there's a lot of study done. So indigenous people, the forest where they live in or the territories that they live in, the rate of deforestation is very low compared to other areas, other natural systems that we see. So Nepal was also part of that conservation model, and based on that, a lot of conservation areas were identified and protected, and Western, I would say, governments, foundations heavily funded that, but that kept the human side away because it was driven by Western ideas of what conservation is. So you don't let humans inside the forest, and nature will grow. It's a good idea, but you are disconnecting people from nature. The honey that we used to harvest, in the forest, they're still waiting for it to come. So there's a relationship, deeper relationship between the natural world and human beings. For indigenous people, there are like grasses that we harvest from the forest to weave baskets, and I think many indigenous people do that. So all these practices, so you see how dependent we are with the natural world. But we don't cut everything, we take what we need for today. That's our principle. We don't harvest so that we can be rich or anything. So it's all about maintaining that respect, reciprocity with the natural world. So that's what happened, and Nepal have many conservation areas, and most of the conservation areas are very close to where indigenous people live, So Guru people, Taman people, um, in the north, they're all Magar people, they all suffered. And there are a lot of evictions as well, just not in Nepal. If you look at Kenya, Ogiek people, Masai in Tanzania, tiger reserves in India. So they all ignore the people living around that area, who have never harmed nature. They have coexisted for a really long time. So you see, the expertise, the knowledge that we're consuming is very one-sided. It's somebody expert, but there is so much knowledge within indigenous community that can be beneficial for human, for our world, and that is always ignored. So conservation is a very Western idea, and there is a lot of ongoing conversation happening how we can make it inclusive when we talk about conservation. So if you know Mau Mau Forest in Kenya, so there are Ogiek people who have been living for centuries in that forest, and they depend on, mutually depend on the forest, and the forest depend on Ogiek people to sustain each other. But the government of Kenya evicted them based on the same idea of conservation. And the government of Kenya gets a lot of money from Western agencies to lead that kind of conservation. Same thing in Tanzania. So Maasai people, they are semi-nomad. They graze their cattle from and move between different borders. They are being evicted as well in the name of conservation. And these private conservations are also popping up a lot in East Africa. And they are also doing the same thing. So where is human livelihood in all of this, who have been very kind and dependent, interdependent with nature, with that land. So you see, it's very non-dualistic, very dual thought, So either nature or human. You see, same thing that I was talking about earlier, but indigenous people don't see that way. The relationship that we hold is much more complex and holistic than what the Western world thinks about when it comes to the relationship indigenous people have with nature. Our knowledge system, our health system, our economy, it's not dual. It's holistic. It's complex web of relationships. That's what the Western or expert fail to understand, and that makes indigenous people vulnerable to vulnerable to migration, moving away, all these things, and so our knowledge system is place-based. So imagine a mining company comes and we speak a very rich languages that has been transmitted orally in many indigenous culture from generations and generations. So just imagine displacing indigenous people from their territory as a result of mining, as a result of violence, as a result of agro-industry, as a result of infrastructure. So they already have a way of life, all this. They have been living. And imagine you see them as poor because you see the world in dual system, either you're poor or rich, So when they move away, when they are displaced, they have to learn a new language. They have to start from zero. And the world around them, the mainstream culture, will look at them as they are very undeveloped, they need help. But what is helpful for indigenous people is that not touch the territory, because they already have this complex system of governance, holistic system of interacting with nature, and they have their own food system that is place-based, that they don't need to import avocado from somewhere else. So displacing indigenous people in the name of conservation, is a Western project or that is implemented by the state, imperialistic wave. So you put them into education system, they forget their language, they become a labor in a cheap labor, and they will remain poor because justice, what do you call the socio-economic institution designed by the state is not developed to integrate these people. So they will always be vulnerable people throughout their life. But when they are in their territory, they are protected. There is social safety net. Um, so you see, like the consequences that can have when we think about conservation. Oh, we should protect the nature and throw the people away. No, indigenous people deserve to be in their territory, and they know what conservation is. Their way of managing resources is very smart, intelligent, innovative, that the world must look at and see how they do it so that we can change the conservations or national parks that we're designing all over the world, which is important, but it has to be led by indigenous people so that they are the one making the decisions. So I'll leave it there so that indigenous people and their future, is guaranteed. So our schools, Stephen, indigenous people schools and universities, our pharmacies, they are all our territory, our forests. So imagine when you take indigenous people away from their, from their territory, you're taking away their school. So indigenous school is not like, the college infrastructure building. It's living. It's not a building, it's living. Our health system is our community, is the health of our territory, is the health of our river. Our economic system is um, equal, you know. Nobody suffers from hunger. Everything is shared. It's regenerative. It's a word that we have developed, but indigenous people have been practicing this regenerative economic system for a really, really long time. you know. So yeah, these are the challenges of conservation, and I hope the world would understand because the conservations that we're talking about is heavily funded. Invest that in indigenous people leadership, and you'll see the benefit. You don't even need to put army because indigenous people are already there, and they are the best guardians of nature. You know, um, and so yeah, so the forest, the territory of indigenous people, river, mountains, there are schools, there are universities. So when we remove that, you see the consequences. They move to the cities, and where would that lead us? We all become the same person, working 9 to 5, eating McDonald's. Yeah, everything becomes uniform. Is that what we want? Um, is that the diversity that we want? So we have to think about that. And indigenous people are the oldest living memory of our Earth, Mother Earth. So we have to protect their language, we have to protect their territory, so that future generations can thrive. And the generation yet to be born can have the same future that their ancestors have had. So those are the things, Stephen. So national park, I'm not a big fan of it. It's a good thing that nature is protected from illegal mining and all these things, illegal hunting and all these things. But it has to incorporate local knowledge, local values, local people, indigenous people, so that it's the natural resources that the is there is governed democratically. People have ownership power. It's just not the state who is based somewhere and they're sending the representatives funded by Western governments, all these things. So I'll stop there. But Nepal, there's a lot of dialogue that's going on that indigenous people's knowledge systems should be integrated, but we're very far away. And it's the same thing happening all over the world, national parks. So tigers are much more important in India than its own people. And tiger reserves, I don't know if you heard of tiger reserves in India. So there's so much funding to protect the species, but $0 is invested in people who have been protecting tiger for a really long time. Because these indigenous people in that reserve, they have been living in that forest a really long time, and they are not the one who kill tigers. So they're being displaced. So this is very concerning. When it comes to what conservation is, how it's designed. You see, like how distant we are from people, our war policies, our conservation policies, it's designed somewhere, and we hardly touch the spirit of the people, where they are. So there's a huge challenge, in this regard. Um, so when we displace them again, they become cheap labor. But they had everything, they had food, they had clean water in the river. They did not need to buy washing machine, but now they moved to the city, all these things, So we're just creating more consumers, into this economic system that we live in. So I'll leave it there. Conservation is a very hot topic. Uh,
Yeah, what you're saying makes sense. I do think sometimes when we think about conservation, we think about people often focus on the animals and the wildlife without thinking about the people and without thinking about both the implications for the people, but also how to incorporate people and also what worked. It's often indigenous people that know how to keep the populations in check and how to keep the system in place. I've seen multiple examples of that where like a national park service tries to conserve threatened creatures, whether animals or wildlife or plants or something like that, and they fail at it, and then they end up consulting the indigenous people who are like, this is how it's most effectively done. One other example that what you're saying reminded me of. So you mentioned Kenya and East Africa. So this example is on the other side of Kenya than the forest that you talked about. But I had some experience in Uganda, and I remember like in northeastern Uganda, you have the Karamojong, who are so that area is desert. It's very arid, and the people typically kind of like the Maasai. They're kind of nomadic or semi-nomadic cattle herders because it's just you have to move around, and they kind of move around to keep their herds going in that kind of desert landscape. But I remember, so there was a book by an anthropologist called I think it's called Mountain People. I'll try to include it in the link for anyone um, who wants to check it out. This book was written in like the 60s. And at the time, the anthropologist goes to kind of understand some of these communities in that area. And this is both Uganda, Kenya. The people are on both sides. And the government, which I think was the newly new Ugandan government, they had just won independence, had considered the land a national park. And as part of that, it was like a wildlife park. So as part of that, they forbidded hunting, which was how many of the people sustained themselves. They often hunted and then gathered, and that was how they kept food. So then suddenly, the majority of their land was now a national park. They couldn't go hunting, they couldn't go do this, and they were starving. He went to go like hang out with them as they were do his ethnographic analysis as they were just like dying by the hundreds or thousands. They were just starving because the government had labeled this place a national park and then forbid them from hunting, and this was very destructive. Let's just say. And I think some of the irony is it kind of it. I mean, this was in the '60s. There's a whole history there for how that plays out now. I remember when I was in Uganda in 2012. I was not in this region. I was in a different region, but where I was, like several hundred kilometers away or several hundred miles away, the Karamanjong will come and migrate there with their cattle, um, and they had to kind of completely alter their paths, um, both both to deal with climate change and to deal with some of the ways that their kind of former way of moving around for their cattle was no longer possible because basically it restricted the land flow. But all this, what you're saying, kind of reminds me of that. It's like you guys have land that you guys are used to inhabiting, and you can no longer occupy it. Um, you were kind of hinting at this, but I'm curious, like, what do you think a better like a better way to I'll ask it like this. What do you think an effective democracy would look like in Nepal? What do you think it would look like to have a system that better incorporated the voices of um, your your people, your community, and other indigenous people?
Um, yeah, managing diverse. Nepal is a very diverse country. It's as is its how to say nature. You know, so managing this is a challenge. For many countries when it comes to diversity. But um, when we treat people equal, equality. In French, we call it égalité. And integrating, building a system that have equal access for every single person, regardless of their origin, their language, is a system that we need. So there was a Maoist war. The Maoist people fought against the state, both the parties, the state and the armed forces, both did a lot of violations when it comes to civilian population. For what, that's the thing. So the leadership came. They even won the election in the Maoist party. But where they are at now, they can hardly hold the party together. So it's a very challenge for Nepal to govern a population that is very diverse. So there are some people who want Hinduism as a national what do you call religion. There are people who are saying the king should come back. So it has divided the country in a very bizarre way. But I feel like the young people have I hope I'm hopeful for Nepal still. The young people can show that they can connect all these diversities into one, just like the forest that I was talking about. Everybody working together to make this country peaceful, prosperous, and and livable for everybody. So there's a huge out migration that is happening. So the new government democracy will work when people don't have to migrate somewhere else. So if you look at that, if you go to the airport, people are crying to leave. Because they are leaving their family, everything, and going to a new country just to make sure that they can have a good living. So the idea of democracy that I envision for Nepal is integrating, I'd say, pathways for every single community, ethnic group to feel that the state is mine. They have the ownership. So, for instance, Tharu people wanted a state, Tharu state. So it's decentralizing. So imagine, so we're a family, like we're four of us or five of us. We give each person something that they want, they need, but at the same time, ensure that they are, how to say, based on their expertise, based on their, strength, and it's also delegating responsibilities. So the state is not heavy. So imagine Tharu people manage their own affairs, manage their own economy, manage their own government. We don't have to depend on state. That lowers the burden of the state. So you see, but without people who don't speak Nepali, without people who pray differently, without people based on what language they speak, that's the problem. So democracy for Nepal is a challenge, but new generation that are running in this election I'm hopeful that they will figure out a solution to contain this diversity into a peaceful way, and there's pathways for people to realize what future they want, and being hopeful. Democracy is hope. It makes people hope for better, and there's pathways to do that, and we need leadership that is the guardian of the forest, like I shared. So democracy is a forest, like a healthy living forest. And we need a very strong steward of that forest, which doesn't allow, who makes the rule of the game, in humans, in terms of human sense, and make sure that law is, how to say, people abide by that law, that is collectively woven, and so that's something that I thought when it comes to democracy. Monoculture forest, one disease can kill everything, but when there is a diversity, it's a strength, and we must celebrate diversity, just not in Nepal, in US, Europe, everywhere. Diversity is a strength, and that's something is used as a political tool to divide people, immigrants, all these things. So we must celebrate diversity and meet people where they are at, rather than assuming that they come from there. So that's something that Nepal should be doing, and address the deeper socio-economic injustices. There's so much harm and healing that Nepal needs to do. We have had so much revolution. Many people disappeared. There's so many commissions that came along for the peace process. Still not complete. So there's so many things that need to be addressed. But also allowing people to, our communities, collective people, so indigenous people are collective people. So allowing them to govern themselves, imagine, so Nepal is a one country, it's not homogeneous, it's multitude of culture. So imagine we water every single flower, every single tree, and let them thrive. It will be a healthy forest, and there is unity, there is respect, there is dignity. So celebrating who they are is very important for leaders to do that, and finding ways to um, make the economy work, so that we're not dependent on foreign labor, like not how to say us going abroad, young people leaving their home and going working in the Gulf countries in hot temperature. A future is possible in Nepal, and that's what this democracy should think about as well. And there's so much geopolitics as well in Nepal, but we need a strong leader to take all the pressure and think about the national interest of the country. National interest doesn't mean that just Nepali speaking people, but there is a diversity of people that live in Nepal. It's just not mountains, it's just not hills, it's just not plains. It's diversity, who thinks holistically for the country and its people, and celebrating each history. So Nepal is also different civilizations in civilization, Newar civilization. There are so many civilizations that is woven together as one, and we cannot replace them by another one. So we have to celebrate each of them and have them dignified. So that's going to be a huge challenge. Corruption is another one. Democratic system doesn't work if there is corruption. You know. And education too. Education is another aspect that needs to go.
Yeah, this makes sense. I mean, I think Nepal has a lot of opportunities. I I I really like your metaphor about the tree in viewing. Sorry, forest. I guess I just missed the forest for the trees, but the about the idea of democracy as like a forest. I mean, one angle of it I was thinking about is that as an ecosystem, you need a lot of different in an ecosystem. You have a lot of different types of creatures that do a lot of different things, and maybe just like that, like in a democracy, you need different types of people. You need activists who push. You need more pragmatists who are um, kind of think a little more slowly. You need like archivists or people who collect and kind of try to understand the past. You need all sorts of different types of things, and maybe just like in a forest, there's different types of animals. You need some that um, do different, ranging from decomposers to predators to animals at the top of the tree, animals at the bottom of the tree. Um, I guess I switched in my mind to the animals. You focused on the plants. Um, but yeah, um, I do hope something's able to happen to kind of help um, build Nepal into a bit of a better thriving democracy. Well, thank you for taking the time now.
Thank you, Stephen.